July 20th, 1960. Atlantic Ocean, 40 nautical miles east of Cape Canaveral, Florida. 0800 local time. Commander James B. Osborn stood in the control room of USS George Washington, hull number SSBN-598, the world's first operational fleet ballistic missile submarine, and watched the depth gauge needle tremble around 60 feet. The air in the cramped compartment was warm, thick with recycled humidity and the sour metallic smell of amine from the CO2 scrubbers, overlaid with hot dust from the instrument panels and a faint trace of hydraulic fluid. The hull temperature matched the surrounding Gulf Stream water, roughly 23 degrees Celsius, but the psychological pressure in the control room was closer to boiling. Osborn had qualified in diesel submarines, ridden out North Atlantic storms in thin-skinned World War II boats, and then bet his career on nuclear power. His orders, transmitted from Submarine Force Atlantic and endorsed personally by the Chief of Naval Operations, were brutally simple. Fire a Polaris A-1 ballistic missile from a submerged submarine and prove that the system worked. The depth gauge read 60 feet. The ship's log recorded 5 knots. Reactor power was at maneuvering speed. Everything was nominal. He forced himself to catalogue the routine details because the routine was the only thing preventing the situation from feeling insane. USS George Washington was a stretched evolution of the Skipjack-class attack submarine, a teardrop hull built around a single S5W pressurized water reactor, with a 7-bladed skewback screw tuned for quiet running. But where Skipjack carried only torpedoes, George Washington carried 16 vertical launch tubes in a massive missile compartment inserted between the control room and the reactor spaces, a 130-foot cylindrical section that had never existed on any submarine design before 1958. The fire control panel to his right, wired into the Mark 80 missile control system, was live. The status lights for tubes 1 through 16 showed green. Tube 1 had been selected for this first submerged launch. Above the steel overhead, 60 feet up through water and spray and air, Polaris missile A-1, serial number known only to a handful of engineers and weapons officers, waited in its flooded tube like a coiled muscle of steel and propellant. Osborn listened to the familiar sounds of a nuclear submarine at patrol depth, the low, continuous rumble of the main coolant pumps, the soft hiss of air through the ventilation ducts, the occasional click as a relay closed somewhere in the maze of cables behind the bulkheads. The soundscape was normal. The mission was not. Until this morning, every American ballistic missile had launched from concrete pads in the desert or reinforced silos buried under American soil. Every submarine-launched missile test had been conducted from the deck of a surfaced boat, its launcher exposed to radar and optical tracking. Today, if everything worked, the missile would leave the submarine in silence, break the surface of the Atlantic like a breaching whale, and light its first stage motor while the submarine remained hidden below, unseen and, in principle, unkillable. Depth, 60 feet. Speed, 5 knots. Trim neutral, the diving officer reported. His voice sounded steady, but Osborn saw the tendons stand out in the young man's neck. Every man in the compartment understood what was at stake. If the launch failed catastrophically, if a structural flaw in the tube, a miscalculated air impulse, or a guidance malfunction caused the missile to detonate underwater, the pressure wave would crush the hull like an egg. The reactor compartment, the missile compartment, the control room itself would implode in milliseconds, and the wreckage would settle on the seafloor in pieces. There would be no damage control. There would be no survivors. He picked up the sound-powered phone to Missile Control. Missile Control, control. Status of Tube 1. The reply came from Lieutenant Harold P. Hal Adams, the ship's weapons officer, standing in the narrow missile control cubicle between the rows of launch tubes. Control, missile. Tube 1 is flooded and equalized. Missile on internal power. Guidance aligned. Launcher ready in all respects. Adams's voice carried the rehearsed cadence of a man reciting a checklist he had run 100 times in drills. But this time, the drill was real. Osborn replaced the handset. His fingertips left a faint film of sweat on the black Bakelite handle. "Very well," he said. "All stations, this is the captain. Stand by for launch of Polaris Missile 1. The words hung in the warm air like a verdict. Osborn checked the ship's clock again. 08:04. The range safety officers ashore expected the launch window to open now. Downrange tracking radars on Ascension Island and at Cape Canaveral were already radiating, their beams raking empty ocean and empty sky. Telemetry receivers were tuned to the missile's frequency. High above the clouds, American reconnaissance satellites, primitive by later standards but functional, recorded the weather along the planned trajectory. Nothing in any of those systems could see the submarine itself. Only the ocean knew where George Washington lay. "Fire control, confirm solution," Osborn ordered. The fire control technician adjusted dials and confirmed the inertial alignment of the missile. "Solution confirmed, Captain. Programmed for surface break at launch point. Free flight to impact point Whiskey. Predicted time of flight, 13 minutes, 22 seconds. 13 minutes for a warhead to travel more than 1,000 nautical miles. 13 minutes between a flash on the horizon and the destruction of a city. It was an abstraction for the men in the control room, but not for the planners in Washington or the men reading reports in Moscow. "Very well. Launch Tube 1, Osborn's voice did not rise. He did not shout. He simply gave the order and felt the decision pass out of his hands into machinery and physics. In the missile compartment, a valve opened. High-pressure air from flasks charged to more than 3,000 pounds per square inch surged into the annular space beneath the missile. The water in the tube had mass and inertia, and for a fraction of a second it resisted. Then the pressure differential overcame the inertia. The water column accelerated upward, pushing the base of the Polaris missile with it. The missile began to move. The acceleration was smooth at first, then sharper, 20 meters per second squared, then 30. The missile became, effectively, a 16-ton piston driven by expanding gas in a gun barrel made of seawater. Osborn felt it as a subtle, upward nudge through the soles of his shoes, a transient change in buoyancy as 28,000 pounds of mass left the hull. The trim indicators quivered. "Compensate for loss of weight," the diving officer said quietly, ordering minor adjustments to the main ballast tanks and variable ballast to keep the submarine level. Above them, the missile rode the water column toward the surface. At 60 feet, water pressure was about 2 atmospheres above ambient. The Polaris missile's steel skin and internal structure had been designed to tolerate the differential for seconds only. If the timing was off, if the pressure equalization valve misbehaved, the stress could buckle the missile before it ever saw the sky. The missile broke the surface in a white fountain of displaced seawater. For a moment, it was a dark shape in the spray, wrapped in a sheath of vapor. Then, precisely as the guidance engineers at Lockheed had calculated, the first stage solid rocket motor ignited. To the tracking cameras on nearby ships and the shore station, the ignition appeared as a brilliant flare punching upward out of the sea, trailing a fat plume of white smoke. To the men 50 or 60 feet below, it was sound filtered through water and steel. A deep, bone-felt thump as the shockwave passed over the hull, followed by a fading roar transmitted through the surface. "Sonar reports surface disturbance bearing 090, range decreasing," the sonar operator called, half in jest, half in awe. The missile was no threat to them now. Its trajectory was outward and upward, away from the submarine. The real threat had already passed at the moment of launch. They had survived it. Osborn kept his eyes on the instruments for another 30 seconds, watching for anomalies. No pressure spikes, no unexpected hull noises. Reactor output stable. He allowed himself to look at the men around him. Some were grinning in disbelief. Others stared straight ahead, hands white-knuckled on their controls. The submarine itself had become ordinary again, just steel and water and equipment. The extraordinary thing was no longer here. It was climbing through the atmosphere, through the thin blue band encasing the planet. tip hot from atmospheric friction, guidance system adjusting minute imperfections in trajectory to deliver an inert test warhead to a patch of empty ocean more than 1,000 miles away. Osborn reached for the high-frequency radio handset that connected them to Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine Squadron headquarters via trailing wire antenna and shore relay. The message format had been approved in advance, cleared by security officers and communications staff who wanted history, but not detail. He spoke the words carefully, knowing they would be read in the Pentagon and then in the White House within minutes. Polaris, from out of the deep to target. Perfect. He hung up the handset. In the missile compartment, telemetry technicians watched numbers scroll across their scopes, confirming that the missile's guidance platform had remained stable, that the staging sequence had worked, that the dummy warhead had separated as planned. On Ascension Island, radar operators tracked the arc of metal as it crossed their screen. Downrange recovery vessels steamed toward the predicted splash point. All of those things would be analyzed later in reports and design meetings. In the control room of USS George Washington, there was only the quiet aftermath, the realization that something impossible according to pre-war naval doctrine had just become routine. The impossibility lay not in the mechanics of the launch itself. Engineers could explain pressure differentials and articulated exhaust nozzles and inertial guidance systems. The impossibility, from the perspective of men who had fought in World War II, was strategic. Before this morning, naval officers believed that fleets could be found, bombers could be tracked, missile silos could be targeted. Locations were fixed, or at least predictable. Now, a city could be destroyed by a weapon launched from a platform whose location was unknown to the enemy, at a time of the attacker's choosing, without warning. The ocean was no longer just a medium of transit or a battlefield. It was a hiding place for Armageddon. Osborn ordered the diving officer to take the ship deeper. Make your depth 200 feet. Maintain 5 knots. The bow planes tilted. The deck took a gentle downward angle. Seawater flowed past the outer hull in laminar sheets, then turbulent swirls as the submarine descended. In the sonar shack, operators listened for any sign that other ships were closing, but the test range had been cleared. No Soviet trawlers lurked beyond the horizon today. No hostile submarines tracked them from the depths. This was a demonstration, not a confrontation. If the demonstration was for the American public, it also had an intended audience, thousands of miles away. In Moscow, the Soviet General Staff received a terse intelligence report within hours. American Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine, USS George Washington, had successfully launched a Polaris missile from a submerged position. Estimated launch point, Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Florida. Estimated range, 1,000 nautical miles. Accuracy, within test parameters. Assessment, United States now possesses survivable second strike capability at sea. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The immediate tactical aftermath for USS George Washington was anticlimactic. She remained submerged, conducted post-launch checks on all systems, and then slipped away to deeper water. Engineers verified that Tube 1 had suffered no structural damage. Reactor technicians logged thermal transients. The crew resumed the rhythm of drills, watches, and maintenance that defined submarine life. The extraordinary had been folded back into the ordinary, but in the offices, where strategy was written, the shockwaves were only beginning to propagate. Moscow, Ministry of Defense, late July 1960. The folder on Admiral Sergei Gorshkov's desk was thin, but its contents were heavy. It contained translations of American press releases, intercepted technical commentary from Western analysts, and a brief summary from Soviet naval intelligence assessing the Polaris launch. The office around him smelled of tobacco smoke and aging paper. Outside, the summer air over the Moskva River shimmered. Inside, the atmosphere was static, as if the walls themselves were listening. Gorshkov had overseen the transformation of the Soviet Navy from coastal defense force to blue water fleet. He understood tonnage, displacement, missile ranges, and sortie rates as instinctively as a chess player understood piece values and positional advantage. He also understood, perhaps better than most Soviet generals, the limits of Soviet industrial capacity. The report in front of him implied that the Americans had sidestepped those limits entirely. They had not built a new class of ships from scratch. They had taken existing nuclear attack submarine designs, ordered the hulls cut in half, and inserted missile sections, trusting their welders and engineers to make the joints as strong as the original steel. It was an approach Soviet yards could not easily copy. He read the summary again. 16 missiles per submarine. Range, approximately 2,000 kilometers for projected follow-on models. Launch depth, tens of meters. Preparation time, minutes. From positions in the central Atlantic, American submarines could target Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Gorky, Minsk, and a ring of industrial cities that formed the heart of Soviet economic power. From the Norwegian Sea, they could cover the Kola Peninsula and the naval bases that housed the Soviet Northern Fleet. From the Mediterranean, they could reach Black Sea ports and southern industrial centers. And the submarines carrying these missiles were not tied to fixed positions. They moved. Item 1. The intelligence officer across from Gorshkov said, sliding another sheet across the desk. May 1960. A U.S. Navy test reports successful launch of a Polaris missile from a surfaced submarine, USS George Washington. Designation still SSN-598 at that time. Item 2. July 1960. Same boat, now redesignated SSBN-598, launches Polaris from submerged position. Item 3. Yard reports from American shipyards, collated from shipping manifests and Western trade journals, indicate that 4 additional boats of the same class, USS Patrick Henry, USS Theodore Roosevelt, USS Robert E. Lee, USS Abraham Lincoln, are fitting out with identical missile systems. Within 2 years, there will be 5 such submarines operational. Within 5 years, Western analysts project, there will be dozens. The reports piled in other offices as well. In the headquarters of the Strategic Rocket Forces, generals accustomed to thinking in terms of land-based ICBMs frowned over charts that showed new arcs of vulnerability. In the KGB's First Chief Directorate, officers compiling assessments of American intentions debated whether the Polaris program was primarily defensive, a guarantee of retaliation, or offensive, a tool for a decapitating first strike launched from close-in waters. In the Kremlin, party officials with limited technical understanding but keen political instincts sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The United States had built a weapon that did not look impressive in parades. It did not roll down streets on heavy transporters. It did not sit on launch pads in dramatic photographs. It hid. And that made it more dangerous. At first, some Soviet naval officers treated the news as an extension of older threats. A missile was a missile, whether it rose from a silo or from the sea. The Soviet Union was already building its own submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the R-11FM and R-13, carried on Project 611 and Project 629 boats. Those missiles required the submarine to surface, raise a launcher, and fire in a procedure that took minutes and exposed the boat on radar for the duration. It was a stopgap measure, a way to show that the Soviet Navy could also put nuclear warheads at sea. But the Polaris system was not a stopgap. It bypassed the vulnerability entirely. That was the impossible element, the thing that violated not physics, but doctrine. As analysis circulated, a pattern began to emerge that was more disturbing than any single data point. The American program had moved with astonishing speed and apparent confidence. The first Polaris flight test from land had taken place in January 1960. By July, a missile of the same family had been fired from a submerged submarine. The engineering problems, pressure equalization, tube design, exhaust management, guidance stability, had been solved in parallel, not in series. It suggested that the United States had been working on submerged launch concepts for years, in secret, while the Soviet Union focused on visible rocketry and spectacular atmospheric tests. Item 1. the GRU analysts wrote in a consolidated memorandum. United States successfully tests Polaris A-1 from submerged platform, achieving operational second strike capability from sea. Item 2. United States naval construction records, open source, show acceleration of ballistic missile submarine production, with keel laying and launch intervals reduced to unprecedented timelines. Item 3. Intercepts of Western commentary indicate plans for forward-deployed SSBNs in Holy Loch, Scotland, and Rota, Spain, placing missiles within shorter flight times of Soviet targets. Item 4. Preliminary acoustic intelligence suggests that the new American boats are quieter than previous nuclear classes, complicating detection by existing Soviet sonar. The conclusion in the memorandum was dry. The emotional impact was not. The Soviet Navy was confronting a threat that could not be met with more of the same. More cruisers, more destroyers, more diesel-electric submarines would not change the fact that American missile boats could lurk beyond the reach of most Soviet sensors and still hold Soviet cities at risk. In that gap between capability and countermeasure, something corrosive began to grow. Doubt. The doubt manifested first in the practical minds of Soviet submarine designers. In Leningrad, at the Central Design Bureau for Marine Engineering, engineers studied the public details of the Polaris launch and tried to reverse engineer not just the technology, but the philosophy behind it. They understood solid-fuel rocket motors in principle. Soviet missile designers had been working on solid propellants since the late 1950s. They understood inertial guidance systems, though Soviet gyroscopes were larger and less reliable than American equivalents. They understood nuclear submarines, though Soviet reactors were noisier and ran hotter than the compact S-5W plants powering American boats. What they struggled to understand was how the Americans had integrated all of these elements so quickly and with such apparent confidence that they would cut functional hulls in half to insert untested missile sections. The question was not whether Soviet engineers could build a submerged launch ballistic missile submarine. The question was whether they could do it fast enough to matter and whether the Soviet economy could sustain the cost. A Project 629 Gulf-class diesel submarine carrying 3 R-13 liquid-fueled missiles cost approximately 70 million rubles to build and maintain over its service life. The missiles themselves required constant attention. Liquid propellants were corrosive and unstable. Storage tanks leaked. Fuel transfer systems corroded. A nuclear-powered equivalent would cost twice as much and require a trained cadre of reactor operators that the Soviet Navy did not yet possess in sufficient numbers. And the Americans were not building one submarine. They were building dozens. In the design bureaus, engineers proposed alternative approaches. If Soviet submarines could not match American technical sophistication, perhaps they could compensate with numbers or tactical innovation. One proposal suggested building large numbers of cheaper diesel boats, each carrying a single missile, and dispersing them across the oceans to create a statistical probability that some would survive a first strike. Another proposal focused on positioning Soviet missile submarines in Arctic waters under the polar ice cap, where American surveillance systems would have difficulty tracking them. Both proposals had merit in theory. Both ran into the same obstacle in practice. The Soviet Union did not have the industrial base to build hundreds of submarines simultaneously, nor did it have the logistical infrastructure to sustain Arctic operations on the scale required. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the institutional response began to take shape. Admiral Gorshkov convened a series of meetings with representatives from the Strategic Rocket Forces, the Naval Staff, and the Ministry of Defense. The tone of these meetings was defensive and at times bitter. Strategic Rocket Force officers argued that sea-based missiles were unnecessary distractions. The Soviet Union already possessed hundreds of land-based ICBMs that could strike American targets. Why divert resources to submarines that were expensive, vulnerable, and operationally limited? Naval officers countered that land-based missiles were fixed targets, susceptible to preemptive strikes, while submarines could move and hide. The debate turned on questions of doctrine, but beneath the doctrinal arguments lay questions of pride and budget allocation. Gorshkov understood that if the Soviet Navy failed to produce a credible response to the American ballistic missile submarine fleet, funding would flow to the strategic rocket forces and the Air Force. The Navy would become, once again, a coastal defense force. That outcome was unacceptable to Gorshkov, who had spent a decade arguing that a modern superpower needed a global navy. He ordered an accelerated development program for Soviet ballistic missile submarines, even though he knew the timeline was unrealistic and the budget insufficient. The first Soviet attempt at a submerged launch ballistic missile submarine was Project 658, NATO designation, Hotel class. These boats were modified from the earlier Project 659 design, nuclear-powered submarines originally intended for cruise missile operations. The modifications included the addition of 3 vertical launch tubes for R-13 missiles, positioned aft of the sail in a raised hump that disrupted the hydrodynamic lines of the hull. The missiles themselves were adaptations of land-based systems, liquid-fueled and requiring careful handling. The launch procedure involved flooding the tubes, pressurizing them to equalize with external water pressure, and then using compressed gas to eject the missile. In theory, it resembled the American Polaris system. In practice, it was slower, more complex, and far more dangerous. The first Hotel-class submarine, K-19, entered service in November 1960, several months after USS George Washington conducted her first deterrent patrol. K-19's operational history would become infamous. During her first year of service, the submarine suffered repeated mechanical failures. The reactor cooling system developed leaks. The missile tubes failed to seal properly, allowing seawater into the compartments housing sensitive electronics. The hull welds, rushed during construction to meet politically mandated deadlines, showed stress cracks. In July 1961, during a patrol in the North Atlantic, K-19's primary cooling system failed catastrophically. The reactor core began to overheat. Without intervention, a meltdown would have breached containment and released radiation into the surrounding water, potentially triggering an international incident if contamination reached NATO waters. The crew jury-rigged an emergency cooling system using seawater pumped directly into the reactor compartment. The men who entered the compartment to execute the repairs knew they were receiving lethal doses of radiation, but they also knew that if the reactor melted through the hull, everyone aboard would die, and the submarine would become a radioactive wreck on the Atlantic seafloor. 8 men died within days from acute radiation sickness. 14 more died within 2 years. The incident was classified for decades, but within the Soviet Navy, K-19 became known as Hiroshima, a grim acknowledgement that Soviet submarine construction standards were inadequate for the missions being demanded. Despite the disaster, the Soviet Union continued to build Hotel-class submarines because the political leadership in Moscow demanded visible symbols of strategic parity. By 1964, 8 Hotel-class boats were operational, a fraction of the American ballistic missile submarine fleet, but sufficient for propaganda purposes. Soviet newsreels showed submarines putting to sea, accompanied by narration describing them as guardians of the motherland. The footage did not show the submarines returning to port after 2 weeks with reactor failures, missile tube leaks, or crew illness from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by faulty ventilation systems. The operational effectiveness of the Hotel-class fleet was marginal. The R-13 missile had a range of 350 nautical miles, less than 1/3 the range of the Polaris A-1. To threaten American cities, Soviet missile submarines had to approach the eastern seaboard of the United States, which meant transiting through waters patrolled by American attack submarines, destroyers, and maritime patrol aircraft. Detection rates were high. American sonar operators routinely tracked Soviet ballistic missile submarines from the moment they departed their home bases in the Barents Sea or the Sea of Okhotsk. Some Soviet commanders reported being shadowed for days by American submarines that announced their presence with a single active sonar pulse before disappearing again into the depths. The psychological toll on Soviet submarine crews became severe. Officers understood that their boats were not survivable in a war scenario. If conflict erupted, American attack submarines would destroy Soviet missile boats within hours, long before the Soviet boats received launch orders. The mission was not to win. The mission was to create an illusion of capability for diplomatic purposes. Crews began to refer to their submarines as floating coffins. Alcoholism rates increased. Disciplinary incidents multiplied. Morale collapsed under the weight of operating equipment that everyone knew was obsolete before it ever left the shipyard. In Washington, American intelligence analysts tracked these developments with clinical interest. CIA reports noted the mechanical failures plaguing Soviet ballistic missile submarines. National Security Agency intercepts revealed internal Soviet communications, complaining about construction quality and operational readiness. Naval intelligence compiled acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines, cataloging the unique sounds produced by each boat's machinery. The data fed into a growing archive that would eventually underpin broader strategic assessments. But in the early 1960s, the immediate conclusion was clear. The Soviet Union was losing the underwater missile race and losing badly. The American advantage was not merely technical, it was systemic. American shipyards operated under rigorous quality control standards enforced by the Navy's Bureau of Ships. Welders were certified, materials were tested, reactor components were inspected multiple times before installation. The SubSafe program, implemented after the loss of USS Thresher in 1963, formalized these standards into a comprehensive safety framework that applied to every submarine under construction. Soviet shipyards, by contrast, operated under production quotas that rewarded speed over quality. Inspectors were pressured to overlook defects to meet delivery schedules. Workers, aware that their bonuses depended on completing boats on time, sometimes skipped steps or used substandard materials when official supplies ran short. The economic dimension of the competition began to warp Soviet defense planning. The Soviet defense budget in the early 1960s consumed approximately 15% of gross domestic product, compared to 6% in the United States. Within that budget, the Navy competed with the strategic rocket forces, the Air Force, the Army, and the massive ground-based air defense network. Every ruble spent on a hotel-class submarine was a ruble not spent on improving radar systems, building land-based missiles, or modernizing tank divisions. Soviet planners faced impossible trade-offs. They could not afford to abandon the ballistic missile submarine program without conceding strategic inferiority to the United States. But they also could not afford to build enough submarines to match American numbers, nor could they afford to build submarines of equivalent quality. Admiral Gorshkov proposed a compromise strategy that would later be formalized as the Bastion concept. Soviet ballistic missile submarines would not attempt to patrol the open Atlantic or Pacific, where detection by American surveillance systems was nearly certain. Instead, they would operate in defensive zones close to Soviet shores, the Barents Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk, protected by layers of surface ships, attack submarines, and land-based aircraft. The strategy reduced the risk of losing the boats to American attack submarines, but it also reduced their strategic value. A submarine patrolling the Barents Sea could not reach targets on the American West Coast or in the central United States. It could threaten Europe, but Europe was already under threat from Soviet land-based missiles. The Bastion strategy was an admission that the Soviet Navy could not compete with the United States in open ocean operations. If you have found this investigation into the first submarine purpose-built to guarantee nuclear retaliation compelling, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold War Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of the weapons that prevented World War III and the men who operated them. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from, or if you or your family members served aboard ballistic missile submarines during the Cold War. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps preserve these stories and ensures that more people understand the technology that shaped the second half of the 20th century. You are part of keeping these memories alive, and we are grateful. The human cost of Soviet strategic inferiority extended beyond the crews of faulty submarines. In the broader Soviet military establishment, the failure to match American ballistic missile submarine capabilities fed into a pervasive sense of technological lag. Soviet officers who had grown up believing that the Soviet Union was the vanguard of socialist progress, destined to surpass the capitalist West through superior organization and ideology, confronted evidence that the United States was outbuilding, outdesigning, and outdeploying them in critical military domains. The cognitive dissonance created bitterness, paranoia, and a search for scapegoats. Some blamed sabotage. Surely, the reasoning went, the Americans could not have developed the Polaris system so quickly without inside information. Perhaps there were spies in Soviet design bureaus, leaking blueprints or alerting the Americans to Soviet technical weaknesses. The KGB launched investigations. Engineers were interrogated. Design documents were audited for evidence of tampering. No major espionage network was uncovered, but careers were destroyed. Anyway, because the investigations themselves became a tool for settling bureaucratic scores and deflecting blame from officials who had approved unrealistic production schedules. Others blamed the inherent limitations of the Soviet economic system. Central planning worked well for mass production of standardized goods, tanks, rifles, artillery shells, but struggled with complex systems requiring tight tolerances and iterative testing. American companies like Lockheed and General Dynamics operated on contracts that rewarded performance and allowed for design changes mid-development. Soviet design bureaus operated on 5-year plans that penalized deviation from approved specifications. If a flaw was discovered during testing, correcting it required approvals that could take months to obtain, by which time production schedules had already slipped. The result was a system that could produce quantity but often sacrificed quality in the process. Still others blamed the Americans for cheating. This was the most psychologically comforting explanation because it preserved the belief that Soviet technology was fundamentally sound and that any failures were the result of external factors. According to this narrative, the United States had access to resources and materials that the Soviet Union lacked. Rare earth elements for guidance systems, advanced computer chips, high-strength alloys, and used that access to gain unfair advantages. There was some truth to this. The United States did have access to a broader range of suppliers and could purchase components from Western Europe, Japan, and other allied nations. But the deeper truth was that American engineering culture emphasized reliability and redundancy in ways that Soviet engineering culture did not, and no amount of rare materials could compensate for that gap. By the mid-1960s, the strategic situation had crystallized into a stable but humiliating equilibrium. The United States deployed 41 ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 16 Polaris missiles, for a total of 656 sea-based nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union deployed approximately 25 ballistic missile submarines of various classes, most carrying 3 to 6 missiles, for a total of fewer than 150 sea-based warheads. American submarines operated globally. Soviet submarines huddled in bastions. American submarines conducted patrols lasting 60 to 90 days. Soviet submarines managed 30 days before mechanical failures forced them to return to port. The disparity was not a secret. It was acknowledged in arms control negotiations, in intelligence briefings, and in the private conversations of Soviet military officers, who understood that the gap was widening, not closing. The long-term consequences of this imbalance shaped the trajectory of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, unable to achieve parity at sea, doubled down on land-based missiles and invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare to threaten American ballistic missile submarines, if war ever came. But anti-submarine warfare proved to be its own technological dead end. Hunting quiet submarines in vast oceans required acoustic sensors, processing power, and operational expertise that the Soviet Union developed slowly and imperfectly. American submarines continued to improve, becoming quieter with each new class, while Soviet submarines remained detectable to Western sonar arrays deployed across key choke points, like the GIUK Gap. The economic strain of trying to compete with the United States in multiple military domains simultaneously, strategic missiles, tactical nuclear weapons, conventional forces, ballistic missile submarines, anti-submarine warfare, air defense, contributed to the fiscal crises that would eventually destabilize the Soviet state. By the 1980s, the Soviet defense budget consumed nearly 20% of GDP, and even that expenditure could not close the capability gaps that had opened in the 1960s. The ballistic missile submarine race was one theater among many, but it was emblematic of a larger pattern. The United States could afford to build high-quality systems in large numbers, while the Soviet Union could afford to build either high-quality systems in small numbers or low-quality systems in large numbers, but not both. The legacy of USS George Washington, then, is not just the technological innovation of submerged ballistic missile launch. It is the demonstration that industrial capacity, quality control, and systems integration matter as much as raw engineering talent. The Soviet Union had brilliant engineers. It had physicists who understood nuclear reactions as well as anyone in the West. It had metallurgists who could work with exotic alloys. What it lacked was an industrial ecosystem capable of turning those individual capabilities into reliable, mass-produced systems that functioned as designed under operational conditions. The Americans had that ecosystem, and USS George Washington was proof of what it could accomplish when directed toward a clear strategic goal. The final months of USS George Washington's active service came in the early 1980s, by which time she was a museum piece compared to the Ohio-class submarines entering the fleet. The Ohio-class boats displaced more than twice as much as George Washington, carried 24 Trident missiles instead of 16 Polaris missiles, and operated with noise levels so low that Soviet sonar could not detect them reliably even at close range. George Washington's S-5W reactor, once cutting edge, was now underpowered. Her sonar suite, designed in the 1950s, could not match the capabilities of modern systems. Her missile tubes, built for Polaris, had been retrofitted to carry Poseidon missiles, but the modifications were awkward and limited her effectiveness. She was decommissioned on January 24, 1985, after 25 years of service. The ceremony was attended by veterans of her early patrols, men who had stood in her control room in 1960 and felt the deck shift beneath them as the first Polaris missile left its tube. Some wept. Others stood silent, remembering the fear and exhilaration of proving that a concept most naval officers had considered science fiction could become operational reality. Commander James B. Osborn, retired by then and living in Virginia, was invited but did not attend. He sent a letter instead, brief and formal, thanking the Navy for the honor of commanding George Washington during her most historic patrol, and expressing confidence that the mission she had pioneered would continue. The hull was towed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, where it was systematically dismantled under the terms of arms control treaties that required the destruction of decommissioned ballistic missile submarines. The missile compartment was cut away and scrapped separately. The reactor was removed, its fuel unloaded, its components sent to secure storage. The remaining sections of the hull were reduced to scrap metal. Nothing was preserved. Unlike some submarines that ended their service as museum ships, George Washington disappeared entirely, leaving behind only photographs, logbooks, and memories. But the mission endures. The submarines that patrol the oceans today are descendants of USS George Washington in every meaningful sense. They carry more missiles. The missiles fly farther and carry more warheads. The submarines themselves are quieter, faster, and capable of diving deeper. But the fundamental mission has not changed. Hide in the ocean, remain undetected. Guarantee that if an enemy launches a nuclear first strike, a devastating response will follow. The logic of deterrence pioneered in 1960 remains the logic that prevents great power war in the 21st century. The technology that made USS George Washington possible, solid fuel rocket motors, miniaturized inertial guidance systems, high-pressure gas ejection from submerged tubes, has been refined over 6 decades, but the core principles remain unchanged. A ballistic missile submarine is a platform designed to survive anything except the end of civilization itself. It operates on the assumption that if its missiles are ever used, the world above the waves will have already been destroyed. The crew lives with that knowledge every day, conducting drills for a mission they hope never comes, maintaining systems that must work perfectly if the unthinkable happens. Modern Ohio-class submarines carry Trident II D5 missiles, each capable of delivering multiple independently targetable warheads with accuracies measured in meters across ranges exceeding 7,000 nautical miles. An Ohio-class boat on patrol in the Pacific can strike targets in Moscow. A boat in the Atlantic can strike targets in Beijing. The submarines do not need to venture into hostile waters to fulfill their mission. They can remain in areas protected by friendly forces under the cover of Allied air power and surface fleets, and still hold every potential adversary's critical infrastructure at risk. This invulnerability, this assurance that the submarines cannot all be found and destroyed before they launch, is what makes the strategic balance stable. The Soviet Union never achieved equivalent capability. Even in the final years of the Cold War, when Soviet Typhoon-class and Delta IV-class submarines represented the peak of Soviet ballistic missile submarine design, they remained noisier than American boats and easier to track. American attack submarines routinely trailed Soviet missile boats during their patrols, gathering acoustic intelligence and demonstrating that, in a conflict, the Soviet boats would not survive long enough to execute their missions. Soviet naval officers understood this. They wrote about it in classified assessments. They argued for more funding, better reactors, quieter propellers. But the Soviet economy, already strained by decades of military competition, could not provide the resources needed to close the gap. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian Federation inherited a ballistic missile submarine fleet that was operationally hollow. Submarines sat pierside for years, unable to deploy, because funding for maintenance and crew training had evaporated. Reactors were shut down to save fuel. Missile compartments were sealed to prevent unauthorized access. A few boats continued to patrol, but their operations were constrained by budget limitations and the awareness that American surveillance systems tracked them continuously. The dream of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet capable of matching American capabilities died not on the ocean floor, but in budget meetings in Moscow, where officials chose between feeding the population and funding submarines that could no longer change the strategic balance. The economic argument, in hindsight, is the most brutal. The United States spent an estimated $100 billion, adjusted for inflation, on its ballistic missile submarine program between 1956 and 1990. The return on that investment was the prevention of nuclear war. The Soviet Union spent an estimated $300 billion on its ballistic missile submarine program during the same period. The return on that investment was strategic parity that existed on paper, but not in reality. Every ruble spent on submarines that could not survive American anti-submarine warfare was a ruble diverted from civilian infrastructure, agriculture, consumer goods, or scientific research unrelated to military applications. The cumulative cost contributed to the economic stagnation that made the Soviet system unsustainable. Historians debate whether the Cold War was winnable through military competition alone, or whether political, economic, and ideological factors mattered more. But in the specific domain of ballistic missile submarines, the outcome was clear. The United States built a system that worked reliably for decades. The Soviet Union built a system that worked intermittently and expensively. The difference between those two outcomes shaped the confidence with which each superpower approached arms control negotiations, crisis management, and long-term strategic planning. USS George Washington herself never fired a missile in anger. She conducted deterrent patrols, participated in exercises, served as a training platform for crews transitioning to newer submarines, and eventually retired when technological progress made her obsolete. But the mission she pioneered continues uninterrupted. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a ballistic missile submarine is on patrol. Somewhere in the Pacific, another submarine glides through deep water, her crew monitoring sonar displays and reactor instruments, executing the routines that keep the boat operational and undetected. The crews rotate, the submarines age and are replaced, the mission endures. The men who served aboard USS George Washington during her first patrols are mostly gone now. Commander James B. Osborn passed away in 1986. The sonar operators, missile technicians, reactor operators, and cooks who made the boat function have scattered to retirements, second careers, or graves. The submarine herself has been reduced to scrap, but the idea she represented, that survival in a nuclear age depends on the certainty of retaliation, and that certainty depends on platforms that cannot be destroyed preemptively, remains foundational to strategic stability. The cutting of the hull, the insertion of the missile section, the welding of new steel to old, the first launch on that July morning in 1960, all of it was driven by urgency and confidence in equal measure. The urgency came from the knowledge that the Soviet Union was building its own ballistic missiles and that the United States needed a survivable deterrent. The confidence came from the belief that American industry could solve any engineering problem if given sufficient resources and freedom to innovate. That combination of urgency and confidence produced a weapon system that changed the calculus of war. In the years after George Washington's decommissioning, strategic analysts and naval historians have argued about whether ballistic missile submarines were the decisive factor in preventing World War III, or whether they were one element among many. Land-based ICBMs provided assured destruction. Strategic bombers provided flexible response. Tactical nuclear weapons provided deterrence at lower levels of conflict. But ballistic missile submarines provided something the other systems could not: invisibility. An enemy could not know where they were, could not target them preemptively, could not destroy them without destroying the world. The philosophical question remains unresolved. Did the world become safer because these submarines existed? Or did it become more dangerous because the weapons they carried were so destructive that any use would be suicidal? Advocates of nuclear deterrence argue that the submarines prevented war by making war unwinnable. Critics argue that the submarines perpetuated an arms race that consumed resources and increased the risk of accidental war through mechanical failure, miscommunication, or miscalculation. Both arguments rest on counterfactuals. What might have happened in a world without ballistic missile submarines is unknowable. What is knowable is that the submarines worked as designed. They patrolled. They remained undetected. They maintained the capability to launch on order. And they were never used. Whether that constitutes success or merely the postponement of disaster depends on whether one believes that human beings are capable of managing weapons of such power indefinitely, or whether the possession of such weapons makes eventual catastrophe inevitable. USS George Washington did not answer that question. She simply demonstrated that the engineering challenges could be solved, that missiles could be launched from submerged submarines, and that a navy could build a fleet of such submarines and keep them at sea for decades. The rest, the strategy, the ethics, the long-term consequences, was left to others to debate. The legacy is technical and operational. Modern submarine design incorporates lessons learned from George Washington's construction and service. The practice of cutting hulls to insert new sections became standard procedure. The two-crew rotation system proved efficient and was adopted for all subsequent ballistic missile submarines. The methods developed for maintaining nuclear reactors at sea informed civilian nuclear power programs. The sonar and acoustic technologies created to track Soviet submarines found applications in oceanography, seismology, and environmental monitoring. The cables and sensors laid on the ocean floor to detect submarines contributed to the mapping of the deep ocean and the discovery of previously unknown geological features. But the legacy is also human. The men who served aboard ballistic missile submarines lived with a burden that few others carried. They knew that the weapons they maintained could end civilization. They knew that if their orders ever came, the world they returned to, if they returned, would be unrecognizable. They trained for that scenario, drilled for it, maintained the equipment that would execute it. And they did so knowing that their success was measured by never having to do it. Commander Osborn's message, sent on that July morning in 1960, captured the duality. Polaris, from out of the deep to target, perfect. The technical achievement was perfect. The missile worked, but the perfection was in service of a mission that, if ever executed, would represent the ultimate failure of diplomacy, deterrence, and human reason. The submarine that proved the mission was possible became the foundation of a strategy that depended on the mission never being necessary. That paradox defines the ballistic missile submarine. It is a weapon designed to prevent its own use. It is a manifestation of human ingenuity and human fear. It is the culmination of industrial capability and the acknowledgement that industry, no matter how advanced, cannot eliminate the fundamental risks of the nuclear age. USS George Washington was the first. She will not be the last. And as long as nuclear weapons exist, submarines carrying those weapons will patrol the oceans, hidden in the deep, guaranteeing a response that no rational enemy would invite. The ocean keeps the secret, the submarines remain invisible, and the mission continues.